Are we recording? Yes. Okay. So today we're going to talk about, we're going to start our conversation on the cardiovascular system, which is the most important body system that we as embalmers will need to know. And today we're just going to talk about the blood, what it's made of. We're going to talk a little bit about blood grouping, the formed elements and plasma, everything that makes up the blood. So there's many functions of the blood. Blood helps us maintain homeostasis. So within the blood and the circulatory system, there's transport of gases, nutrients, and waste products. There's transportation of processed molecules, transportation of regulatory molecules, regulation of blood and moisture, pH in the body, and osmosis, the maintenance of body temperature, protection against foreign substances, and clot formation. Whoops. Okay. So blood is a type of connective tissue. Remember, there's 4 different types of tissue, and blood is a liquid connective tissue. So it consists of a liquid matrix, which is the plasma, and formed elements, which are cells and cell fragments. So if you look at this image that I have on this PowerPoint, this is after a blood diagnostic test. So what they do is say you're donating blood or you're getting your blood test, they'll put it in a machine and the machine spins it around really fast to separate everything. So this is what a normal blood looks like. So when I say hematocrit, that's just a blood diagnostic test. That's not significant to mortuary science, but this is just to give you a visual. So about half of it is plasma, which has hundreds of different things in it, but most importantly, water, proteins, nutrients, your hormones, and everything else. And plasma is this kind of clear liquid. There's this buffy coat in between the plasma and the red blood cells, which is this little white layer. It's very small, and those are your white blood cells and your platelets. And then at the bottom is your red blood cells. So as you can see, that's the normal blood. And then you can see anemia. And let me move my chat box. And polycythemia. So anemia is when there's a decrease or depressed red blood cells in the blood volume. And polycythemia is when there's an excess of red blood cells. So the total blood volume in the average adult, there's about 4 to 5 liters in females, about 5 to 6 liters in males. So plasma is the first part we'll talk about. It's a pale yellow fluid consisting of about 91% water and 9% of other substances, and that's your proteins, nutrients, gases, wastes. Plasma is a colloid, which is a liquid that contains suspended substances that don't settle out. So when I say colloid, you can think of oil and water and how that oil will just kind of float there. That's how plasma is. And most of the suspended substances are plasma proteins. And there's 3 groups of plasma proteins. That's albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. Okay. I'm going to exit out of this real quick just to make sure I'm not missing any notes. And I did. Okay. So let me turn my notes on. Okay. Back to the blood. I just kind of want to clear this up. So you know how we have gas exchange via our blood? What happens is when we breathe, oxygen goes into our lungs and it enters the blood in the lungs and it's carried to the cells. And the carbon dioxide produced by cells, when they're using energy and creating different things, they'll have waste products, and carbon dioxide is one of them. It's carried in the blood to the lungs where it's exhaled. And the blood transports ingested nutrients, ions, and water from the digestive tract to the cells. And the blood transports the cell's waste products to the kidneys for elimination. So blood's doing all this. where it's transporting oxygen that we breathe in to our lungs, through our lungs, throughout the body, taking those waste products from around the body back to the lungs where we exhale it. It's also taking things out of, like, you know how the kidneys filter blood and everything, those waste products that the kidneys take out of the blood are eliminated via our urine. And a lot of substances that can be produced in one part of the body, especially hormones, they have to go through the blood circulatory system to another part of the body. And that can be different things such as the lactate produced by skeletal muscles during exercise. Blood has to carry that to the liver, which converts it into glucose, which is sugar, and that's how we have energy. Let's see. I knew I was forgetting something. I'm so sorry if I confused anyone. We'll also go over this next week too, because as you can see, virtual learning for me is still a little new. Okay, so the blood carries hormones. So we just covered the endocrine system. We know that hormones go through the blood, and it also carries enzymes. And enzymes are catalysts that affect body processes. They basically like force it to happen. And sometimes these have to go from one part of the body to the other. So they get in the blood circulation and they travel. We have buffers in our blood that keeps the blood pH in between the normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. So almost neutral, just a little slightly basic. Most of our body processes happen at a slightly basic level. And then blood also helps us keep our body temperature regulated. Our body actually moves warm blood from the interior of our body to the surface, and that's where heat is released. Okay, I've got all of that. And then we also have clot formation, another function of blood that protects against excessive blood loss when a blood vessel is damaged. And I'm going to show y'all how that happens towards the end of this lecture. So in our blood, we have these enzymes. No, not enzymes. We have fibrin in our blood. And when there is a damage to a blood vessel, that fibrin goes in and they patch it up. But we also have to remember that just because one part of the body needs blood clotting, the rest of the body doesn't. So the blood has to work simultaneously in different areas in different ways. Okay, so blood was a connective tissue with the liquid matrix. That's the plasma containing cells and cell fragments. Those cells that are in the blood are your red blood cells, white blood cells, and the cell fragments are platelets. So plasma is the liquid matrix. We have formed elements. Did somebody say a question?
No, that was me, Miss Eeks, joining the class. This Sharon.
Okay.
Hi, Miss Eeks.
Hello.
That's my daughter.
I'll be joining your class next year.
What?
She said what?
I'll be joining your class next year. If God
that's awesome. That would be so cool. Okay. So, composition of blood. Okay. Plasma was the liquid matrix, right? That's about 91% water, I believe. I had it over here. And then we have formed elements. And the formed elements are the cells and the cell fragments, the cells being the red blood cells, white blood cells, the fragments being platelets. Okay, blood makes up about 8% of the total weight of the body, so not a whole lot. And if anybody has ever gone to give blood, a really neat fact about blood donation, I mean, it's really amazing that you can go, and I know not everybody's for it, and that's totally fine, but your body can actually lose a lot of blood. And sometimes, which, you know, when you give blood, they tell you not to go for about 8 months after. And that's because your body has to have time to replace everything. Well, if there is like a car accident, or if there's some kind of trauma that happens and somebody loses a lot of blood and say they're not able to get a blood transfusion, sometimes they can actually replace the blood volume with like a saline or like a hydration bag. And it, by replacing that blood volume, even though there's not necessarily the red blood cells that we need, your body will keep producing those red blood cells and eventually replace it. So the blood is really fascinating. So we talked about plasma, and that was the liquid part of the blood, pale yellow. It's a colloid, so it contains suspended substances that don't settle out. And there's 3 groups of plasma proteins: albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. Okay. So these are the plasma proteins. Albumins bind and transport other molecules in the blood, such as fatty acids, bilirubin, and thyroid hormones. So they're important in regulating the movement of water between the tissues and the blood. That's their main function, but they can also bind and transport fatty acids and bilirubin, which is what causes the yellow. That's something to do with the liver. So bilirubin is that yellow of bile, and the thyroid hormones. Globulins are, their main function is transporting substances and protecting against microorganisms. And fibrinogen is responsible for the formation of blood clots. Serum is plasma without the clotting factors. So what happens when you have a blood clot is the fibrin, and there's like this matrix of fibrin that help patch that blood vessel, and they actually pull the blood vessel together. And by pulling it together, that serum is actually squeezed out and is put into the blood. And so that's plasma without fibrinogen. Plasma volume in the blood has to remain relatively constant. And that's because we have suspended or dissolved substances in the blood that come from the liver, the kidneys, the intestines, endocrine glands, the immune system. Oxygen enters the lungs, leaves the blood as it flows through the tissues. Carbon dioxide enters the blood from the tissues and leaves the blood as it flows through the lungs. I don't know why I put that there. I'm so sorry. Okay. So those are your plasma proteins, and don't get too hung up on this because this is just your foundation for learning about the blood vessels. So there's a lot of like little intricacies within the blood circulatory system. But don't be intimidated, because for mortuary science, we're more focused on learning those blood vessels, those arteries and those veins and their locations so that you're able to locate them. Okay. So the formed elements of the blood, these are important. The formed elements include your erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus. Leukocytes are your white blood cells. They do have a nucleus. And your thrombocytes are your platelets and your cell, which are your cell fragments, and they do not contain a nucleus either. So red blood cells make up about 95% of the volume of the formed elements, and the other 5% is white blood cells and platelets. So your red blood cells are the majority of your blood composition, your formed elements composition. Where am I at? Okay. So hematopoiesis, I looked up how to pronounce that, is the process of blood cell production. So that's the production of your blood cells. And in the fetus, in the embryo and the fetus, hematopoiesis occurs in tissues such as the yolk sac, the liver, the thymus, the spleen, lymph nodes, and red bone marrow. after an infant is born, that process of blood cell production is confined primarily to red bone marrow. And in young children, almost all of the bone marrow is the red bone marrow. Remember, there's two different types of bone marrow, and that's red and yellow. Red bone marrow is where red blood cells, well, all of your blood cells are produced. Okay, in the adult, the red marrow is confined to the ribs, the sternum, the vertebrae, the pelvis, the proximal femur, which is the one closest to the point of attachment to your hip, and the proximal humerus, which is this part of your arm closest to the point of attachment, your shoulder. Eventually, as you grow and develop, yellow marrow replaces red marrow in all the other body locations. And yellow marrow is where the body stores fats and deposits of certain types of minerals. And all the formed elements of the blood are derived from stem cells within the red bone marrow known as hemocytoblasts. So that's just a quick overview of how the formed elements are produced. What you need to know is that blood cells are produced in red bone marrow. In the fetus, it's primarily the spleen, but then after birth, and after birth, it's all the bone marrow because the child is still developing. And then in the adult, it's mainly your ribs, sternum, vertebrae, pelvis, femur, and humerus. Okay. So your red blood cells are your erythrocytes, which are biconcave discs, which is just an adjective to describe the shape of them. You can see in this picture how it kind of dips in a little bit on both sides. So biconcave, there's like a little depression on each side. They do not contain a nucleus. They contain a pigment called hemoglobin, which colors the cells red. The primary function of erythrocytes are for transportation of oxygen from the lungs to the body tissues and the transportation of carbon dioxide from the body tissues to the lungs for exhalation. There is a process called hemolysis. So anytime you see lysis, that means breakdown. So hemolysis. And that's when red blood cells rupture and hemoglobin is released into the plasma. So about 1.5% of red blood cells are just dissolved into the plasma. And hemolysis occurs in hemolytic anemia. It'll occur in blood transfusion reactions if the patient starts to reject that type of blood because of the antigens and antibodies on those blood cells. And it also can occur in hemolytic diseases of newborns, which is caused by a different blood group called the Rh blood group. Hemolysis also occurs in malaria. Okay, just making sure I'm not missing anything. So let's talk about hemoglobin, which is what colors the red blood cells red. So a hemoglobin molecule consists of 4 heme and 4 globin molecules. You do not have to remember this. I'm just demonstrating. So the heme molecules transport the oxygen, and the globin molecules transport carbon dioxide and nitric oxide, which are waste products. Iron is required for oxygen transport. So that's what comes into play when people that suffer from anemia, iron has to be in the blood. So people with an iron deficiency will have blood disorders, and they'll usually have some complications arise from that. And that goes down to the hemoglobin. So the life cycle of red blood cells. Did anybody have any questions so far? Okay.
No.
Okay. All right. Oh, I love that background. That's cute. Okay. So erythropoiesis. So poiesis meaning production. Erythro meaning red blood cells. That's the production of red blood cells. So you have stem cells in the red bone marrow that eventually give rise to late erythroblasts, which lose their nuclei and are released into the blood as reticulocytes. Once again, don't be intimidated. We're just going to get through this together. So basically, the stem cells that are in the red bone marrow, they produce the erythroblasts, which eventually turn into the erythrocytes. So the blast is the like the immature. I haven't had enough coffee today. So the blast isn't fully formed. They lose their nucleus. They're released into the blood, and then they lose their endoplasmic reticulum. After they lose that, it produces a red blood cell. The normal lifespan of a red blood cell is about 120 days in males and about 110 days in females. And that's just because biologically, most of the time, males are larger than females, so they have a larger content. There's like all these intricacies, but that's just normal. You know, that doesn't mean everybody. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus, which means they cannot divide or produce new proteins. So eventually, after 110 to 120 days, they rupture. They release that hemoglobin into the blood. Hemolysis occurs, not in a damaging way, just as an end of the life cycle. They're phagocytized by macrophages, okay? Which basically just means one of the macrophage's job in the blood, I believe that's a white blood cell, we'll get to it in a second. It basically just Pac-Mans it, eats it to get rid of that in the blood. The hemoglobin is broken down. The heme becomes bilirubin, which is secreted in the bile. In response to low blood oxygen, the kidneys will produce erythropoietin, which stimulates the process of this production of red blood cells. So if you have low blood oxygen, the kidneys will stimulate erythropoiesis. Okay, so let me just go down to my little note here. Any process or disease that causes increased destruction of red blood cells will cause jaundice, which is a yellow staining of the skin, starts in the sclera of the eye, which is the white of the eye. And it can cause a buildup, or it's caused by a buildup of bile pigments in the blood and in some tissues. And this is caused by damage by toxins, genetic defects, infections, and immune reactions. Another cause of jaundice is dysfunction of liver tissue, which can be caused by alcoholism and anything that could block that duct system that drains bile from the liver. So any damage to the liver or any kind of process or disease that destroys those red blood cells, you'll get that yellowish staining of the skin because that hemoglobin is breaking down that heme, which is part of that. So like 4 heme, 4 globins, those heme get broken down and they turn into bilirubin, which is that yellow staining color, the color of bile. Okay, so that's your red blood cells. Which is the majority of your formed elements. Now we have white blood cells. So white blood cells are known as leukocytes. So if I said leukemia, that already denotes that is a disease or disorder concerning leukocytes, your white blood cells. So there's the way that scientists study blood cells is that they have to have a microscope and they have these slides and they have to stain the slides in order to see these cells. So this is not going to be on a test. There's 2 categories based on this staining prep in order to observe blood cells. And there are granulocytes, which are white blood cells with large cytoplasmic granules and lobed nuclei. They stain a certain color. And then there's agranulocytes, which is blood cells that appear not to have granules, and their nuclei are not lobed. Okay, so that's just for me to explain how they're separating them. It's just basically how they look under a microscope. So granulocytes are larger, you can see the granules, and agranulocytes doesn't mean they don't have them, you just can't really see them under a microscope. Okay, so there's two categories. The granulocytes, the ones that we can see under the microscope, you do have to know these different types because certain white blood cells go to certain injury sites. So you have your neutrophils, and there's a little picture down there. You can see it has 4 lobes. They stain under a microscope or under that staining preparation with both acidic and basic dyes. That's not pertinent to mortuary science. But you do need to know, this is important. This will be a test question later on in pathology. Neutrophils are the white blood cells that first respond to infection. So they go to the injury site, the infection site first. They will remain in the blood 10 to 12 hours, and then they move on to different tissues. Neutrophils will leave the blood and seek out and phagocytize bacteria and other foreign matter. So they're pac-manning all that bacteria, getting rid of all that, keeping us healthy, keeping bacteria out of our blood. After they leave the blood to nobly protect us, they can survive 1 to 2 days, and that's pretty much it. Eosinophils, they'll stain red with acidic dyes. You don't have to know that. Eosinophils are important in the defense against certain worm parasites. So that's their function. Eosinophils attach to worms and kill parasites that come into our blood. You'd be surprised how often that occurs. Eosinophils, they can also increase in number in tissues experiencing inflammation, such as an allergic reaction or trauma. Anywhere there's swelling, eosinophils will expand in number, and inflammation serves a purpose, and we'll talk about that later. Basically, it cuts off the blood supply to prevent any infection or any debris from leaving the injury site to go anywhere else in the body. Another granulocyte is a basophil. Basophils stain blue or purple with basic dyes. That's just how they're categorized. They leave the blood and migrate through other tissues. They will also increase in number in allergic and inflammatory reactions. They release large amounts of histamine, which increases the inflammation. And they also release heparin, which inhibits blood clotting. So what'll happen is if there is an allergic reaction, or say I fall and break my elbow, it'll get really swollen because that inflammation, those basophils, those eosinophils are trying to increase that inflammation to keep the injury local to that site. Let me make sure I'm not missing any important notes. One day I'll figure out. Okay. So let's talk about the last 2 white blood cells. So the white blood cells, there's 5 different types of white blood cells. There are your neutrophils, which are the first of the white blood cells to respond to infection. The eosinophils, which are important in the defense against worm parasites. Yeah, we have a specific function for that. And then we have basophils, which will release histamine and heparin at the site of infection or trauma. And then we have these last 2, the lymphocytes and the monocytes. So the lymphocytes are the smallest white blood cells. They originate in red bone marrow and migrate to the lymphatic tissue. So we haven't talked about the lymphatic system yet. That's your immune system. That's your spleen, your thymus, and your lymphatic vessels. So lymphocytes originate in red bone marrow. They're white blood cells. They migrate over to the lymphatic system. And they're mostly in that immune system, in the lymph nodes, tonsils, nodules, thymus, and spleen. You'll notice if you ever get an infection, your lymph nodes will swell up right here. If you ever have swelling under your armpits, that's another major site for lymphocytes. That means you have an infection. You should probably go to the doctor. So, certain lymphocytes play a role in immunity. There's several, but the two main ones that we talk about are the B cells of lymphocytes and the T cells. So B as in boy. B cells produce antibodies because every cell in our body has a marker on the outside, so our body recognizes it as part of us. Any cell, any bacteria, anything that comes into our body with a different kind of marker, our white blood cells will attack it. T cells protect against the viruses and microorganisms. So B cells produce the antibodies. T cells protect against viruses and other microorganisms. T cells are also involved in the destruction of tumor cells and tissue graft rejections. I had to have a graft done on both of my eardrums. So what happened is when I went, oh my gosh, it's snowing. Okay, sorry, it hasn't snowed here yet. Okay, sorry, I got excited. So what happened is when I went to have my surgery done, they had to put me under. They had to, I don't know how they did it, but they sliced my ear all the way down the back, folded it over, and took a tissue graft. I guess it was from a donor, from an organ donor. No. They took tissue from a different part of my body, I think. Anyways, tissue graft, they placed it on my damaged or my missing eardrum. So in order for that to work, my body had to accept that tissue graft. If it didn't, it would have produced an infection. There would have been swelling. It would have rejected it. It would have been really bad. So that is where T cells come into play. Any kind of tissue graft rejection, the T cells are responsible for that. Okay, so monocytes. Monocytes are the largest white blood cells. So you have your lymphocytes, which are your smallest. Those are in your immune system. Your monocytes are the largest white blood cells. They remain in the blood 3 to 5 days before they leave the blood and transform into macrophages, which are amazing Pac-Man. They phagocytize bacteria, dead cells, cell fragments, and other debris. If there's an increase in monocytes, like if you go to the doctor, they'll check your blood levels. If there's an increase in the monocytes in the blood, that is a sign of a chronic disease or infection. When I say chronic, I mean that it occurs over a long period of time or duration. If I say acute, that means short onset. So if you have an increase in monocytes, that means that there could be a chronic disease or a chronic illness that you're dealing with. So those are your white blood cells. There's 5 types. Just know the main function of them. So lymphocytes, which would be immune system, antibodies, and protection against viruses. Monocytes, they turn into macrophages and phagocytize bacteria. Okay, then we have our platelets. Platelets or thrombocytes. So your red blood cells are erythrocytes, your white blood cells are leukocytes, and your platelets are thrombocytes. And these are tiny fragments of cells. They're not cells themselves. They're actually just fragments. So they have cytoplasm and they have a plasma membrane. And on the platelets, you have proteins and glycoproteins on the surface that allow them to attach to other molecules. So they play an important role in preventing blood loss because they, at the site of a blood vessel injury, which would actually, I mean, that occurs inside our bodies. We don't know it, but this happens like all the time. The thrombocytes will go to that injury. They'll form a platelet plug where they basically plug it up and they seal the holes. They promote the formation and contraction of blood clots, and they'll help seal off larger wounds in vessels. Are we still good so far? Let me make sure nobody's popped up in the chat box real quick. I don't think so. Also,
Ma'am.
hey, Sky.
Hey, Miss Eats.
Okay. I can't. Oh, there's my. Is that my chat box? Nope. Okay. If anybody has hopped in the chat box, I'm so sorry. I cannot see it right now. Okay. So I'll check it in a minute. I think I have to stop sharing my screen. So we'll get to that. Okay. If y'all have any questions, just pop them in the chat box, and at the end, I can look at them. Okay. So we talked about erythrocytes, leukocytes, thrombocytes. Okay. We're still technically on thrombocytes. So there is a process called hemostasis. Sorry, my cat. There is a process called hemostasis, which means it's the cessation or the stopping of bleeding. When a blood vessel is damaged, a series of events helps prevent excessive blood loss. Okay, so there's 3 different things that can happen. The first is a vascular spasm. Let's see. Let me see. Okay, sorry. Vascular spasm, an immediate but temporary constriction of a blood vessel. So it occurs when inside your blood vessel, you have this lining of epithelial tissue called endothelium, which means it's on the inside of a blood vessel. So that when there's a tear or a hole in a blood vessel, that smooth muscle, that endothelium, will contract and try to pull it together, to pull those sides of the hole together. And it can help close those vessels completely and stop the flow of blood through them, to stop hemorrhaging. So that's vascular spasm. That's for a pretty small injury. Okay. A platelet plug is where platelets congregate together and they seal small breaks in the blood vessels. It's not the same as a blood clot. A platelet plug is when small vessels and small vessels and capillaries have small tears every day. We don't know about it. And then a platelet plug quickly closes that tear. And so people who lack the normal number of platelets tend to develop small hemorrhages in their skin and organs. And, as we age, we'll start to lose some of that. And if you've ever seen some elderly people, they have the purpura, those purple bruises all over their arms, and those are hemorrhages, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their circulatory system isn't functioning. Sometimes as you age, you'll have those small hemorrhages because of the lack of platelets. Okay, so now we get to blood clotting, which is coagulation. So if a blood vessel is severely damaged, coagulation results in a clot. A blood clot is a network of thread-like protein fibers called fibrin, which basically make a net that trap red blood cells, platelets, and fluids into that. They'll form that little net. And then I'm about to show you what it does after that. This is really important because hemostasis is important for homeostasis, because if we don't stop bleeding, excessive bleeding from a torn blood vessel would result in a positive feedback cycle consisting of ever decreasing blood volume and blood pressure that disrupts homeostasis, and it would ultimately result in death. So it's very important that our blood have these formed elements that can help stop the loss of blood. Okay, so with blood clots, without control, clot formation would spread from the injury site through the entire circulatory system, and that wouldn't be good. It'd be rock solid. Our blood contains several anticoagulants that prevent the clotting factors from initiating clot formation during normal concentrations of the blood. So you only want to have blood clots in that injury site or that infection site. And then away from that, the clotting factors are so diluted in the volume of blood that the anticoagulants neutralize them. And the clotting, if I slice my arm off up here, I need all of my blood clotting factors to be here, not in this hand. So that's how the body controls that. And the danger of blood clots is that if platelets encounter a damaged or diseased area in a blood vessel, a thrombus occurs. A thrombus is a stationary blood clot, and it serves to kind of plug that vessel. What can happen is that if a thrombus breaks loose from that vessel, it's a free-flowing emboli in the bloodstream, and it's known as an embolus. And it can actually block a smaller arteriole, it could block a capillary and cause death, especially if it blocks a vessel that supplies blood to the heart, lungs, or brain. So that's the danger of blood clots, is that it could actually turn into an emboli, which is a free-flowing thing in our blood system that can stop the flow of blood to major organs. And that's why some people don't take aspirin unless your doctor tells you to. A lot of people will need, as you age, you'll need to take aspirin, and that kind of has a role in the blood, but we'll talk about that next week. Okay, so once a clot is formed, we don't want that blood clot to stay there forever. We need it to go away. So we have this process called clot retraction. And clot retraction is where the blood clot condenses into a denser, more compact structure. I'm so sorry I don't have a picture here. Last night, when the weather was starting to get a little bad, I lost internet. So I have it now, but I haven't had a chance to add pictures. Okay, but I will. And I've got a video for y'all today too, which will help illustrate this and clear up any confusion. So clot retraction is a process where the blood condenses into a denser, more compact structure. And as it retracts, serum is squeezed out of the clot. Serum is that plasma which fibrin and clotting factors have been removed. The clot retraction pulls the edges of the damaged blood vessel together, stops the blood flow, reduces infection, and enhances healing. Eventually, within a few days, that blood clot will dissolve. And there's the process that dissolves blood clots is fibrinolysis. Sorry, my cats. Okay, so fibrinolysis is the process that dissolves blood clots. Just be familiar. If you say lysis, that means breakdown. Fibrin, that helps create blood clots, so breakdown of blood clots. And the last thing, thank y'all so much for hanging with me today. I'm so sorry I didn't realize I was going to go for a full hour. I'm at 44 minutes. This is the last slide. Because I know it's kind of hard doing virtual learning. I'm not used to it. I know y'all are not used to it. Thankfully, we'll be back in class next Tuesday. So, hang on, I gotta sneeze. Okay, I guess I don't have to sneeze. Okay, So there's 3 blood groups. There's 3 human blood groups. And that's type A, type B, and type O. Sorry, it's like ABO, but there's also type AB. Okay, so that's how we categorize human blood. That's how we do blood transfusions. It's really important to know your blood type. A lot of people don't know their blood type. For example, I don't know my husband's blood type, and it makes me really anxious because I'm like, Chris, what happens if like we're in a car accident? Like, I don't know if I can give you blood. Anyway, find out your blood type. I am O negative. Okay, no, I'm O positive. Sorry. Okay, so the ABO blood group basically just means the type of blood you are has the presence or absence of A and B antigens on the surface of red blood cells. I know that's a lot of words. So every cell in your body has markers on them, and that's so your body recognizes them as your own. So with your red blood cells, that's how we type blood, is using the red blood cells. Your red blood cells can have A antigen markers, which means that you were type A blood. If you were type A blood, that means you have B antibodies. So you have A antigens, where if you received type A blood, that your cells would recognize that as type A blood. If it was type B blood, they have antibodies that would attack type B blood. Okay, I know that's kind of confusing. If you have type B blood, that means you have B antigens, which mark your blood as that specific type of blood. It has type A antibodies. So type B would attack type A blood if you got it in a transfusion. If you have type AB blood, you can receive A or B blood because you have both of those antigens and neither of those antibodies. If you have type O blood, you can donate to anybody because you don't have any antigens, but you have both A and B antibodies. So I know that's really confusing. Type A blood can only receive type A blood. But they can also receive type O blood because O blood doesn't have markers on them. So the body that's receiving the blood transfusion is not supposed to attack type O blood because it doesn't have a marker. Does that kind of make sense? I hope that makes sense. There is another type of blood group called the Rh blood group. And I didn't put it on this slide because it's not really relevant. I mean, technically blood type isn't relevant, but I decided to talk about it today. Sorry, I have cat hair all over my laptop. Okay, so there's another type of blood group called the Rh blood group. And the Rh is named because it was studied in a type of monkey called the rhesus monkey, which is like spelled Rhesus. And almost everybody in the United States, well, not almost, but most people in the United States are Rh positive, meaning we have that specific type of antigen in our bodies. This comes into play when a woman gets pregnant. So let me pull up a little visual aid for y'all. Rh. Because this is really interesting. And this is where diseases, hemolytic diseases, and why are you pausing my screen share? Resume share. Nope. Nope. New share. Okay. So Rh is, hang on a second. You never really get tested for it. The only time it comes into play is if you get pregnant. So women, if they get pregnant and they are Rh positive, does nothing. If the father is Rh positive, it's fine. So I'll put this here to kind of have that. So if a mother is Rh positive and she has a child by a father who is Rh negative, it won't do anything for the first pregnancy. But if they try to have another one, the body will recognize that Rh negative and attack it, and they will no longer be able to have a second child or a third, or, well, they wouldn't have a second one. So it's really important for having children to know, if your partner is Rh negative, if you're Rh positive, because they can mix once, but not twice. And so that's just really interesting. It's very complicated. It's not significant to your boards. Don't worry about it. I just kind of wanted you to know about it because in pathology, we will discuss it. Are you home?
Miss Eads, Miss Eads,
Yes.
that works that way because of like allergic reactions. You don't develop an allergic reaction to something until the second time you're around it.
Yeah,
Same way with
exactly.
your blood.
Yes, thank you, Vicki. That's exactly right. Because the first time the body wouldn't know anything's wrong.
Yeah.
But then the second time it'd be like, oh, wait, hang on a second. So that's absolutely right. Thank you. That's awesome. Okay. Oh my gosh, my Zoom. So am I still sharing? Stop share. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on the blood right now? It's totally okay if you don't. We will also kind of do a brief recap next week because I know not everybody could come today. Oh, I've got 12 participants. But for anybody that missed it, we'll still recap it next week and make sure we've got full understanding. So for homework, I did.
Yes, ma'am, because I'm most definitely gonna need it.
Oh yeah, don't worry. We'll hit it next week too.
I said I'm most definitely gonna need it because I really didn't understand it.
Oh, okay. What is there anything I can help you with now, or do we just need to do it in person next week?
I think
We need to do it in person.
better if we just do it in person.
Okay.
Because I don't. Yes, ma'am. Because I don't understand anything like online.
Yeah, I know. It's a struggle.
We need to do it in person, Miss Eats.
I know, Archie.
I'm sorry, y'all. My name Cortez Jackson. I'm sorry, y'all.
I was wondering. I was like, we got a new student. Okay.
Oh, no. That's RJ. Those just wondering.
So, guys, this week, oh my gosh, it's snowing so bad. This week, I did make y'all a Connect assignment, but guess what? It only has 20 questions. I made sure. Only 20 questions.
Praise God.
I know. I'm so sorry. So try to do that and click on the reading that's associated with the answer. I mean, is that right? Yeah. So when it says like for further reading, read that. I see you, Scott. You also have just a fun discussion board. I know it's work, but it's not a whole lot. What I want you to do is so 20 questions on the Connect. For the discussion board, I want you to, and I saw 2 of you have already done it. I saw Shelby did it, and I think someone else did. I haven't read it yet. Find a disease or an illness that affects the blood system. And the instructions are there. Tell me in one paragraph, tell me how it affects the body and if it would pose a safety risk to the embalmer. So you'll see that under discussion board. I also, for those of you who want to study on your own and use supplemental reading, my PowerPoint goes exactly the way your text does, and I left out anything that wasn't important. So if you do want to look at your textbook, this PowerPoint does go along with it, and it'll help you a little bit. But I uploaded a study guide on Canvas that has everything that you'll need to know. And you can research that, and you can Google it because, I mean, it's anatomy, so all the answers are the same. So if y'all don't have any questions, this is recorded. I'll post it. We will do it in person again next week, and also the heart, because I think once we can just do a short recap next week, and then we'll do the heart. So if y'all are good, y'all can head out. I appreciate y'all logging in today and being here with me. Thank you, Candace.
I was a little late today, so what system did we just go over? I was listening, but I didn't get the system we were studying. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's totally fine. It's the cardiovascular system.
Oh,
The
okay,
blood.
okay. And
So
you said
all
the heart next week?
yes. So for this
Okay.
week, all I want you to know is what the blood's made of. That's all I need you to know.
Okay.
All right. I
Thank you, Missy.
appreciate y'all. Thank you. And y'all just let me know if y'all have any questions. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Miss Eats.
Bye. Have a
Thank
good one.
Bye. See y'all later.
Bye.
Stay safe and stay warm.
Bye,
Yeah.
y'all.
Peace.
All right. Y'all be
It's
safe.
cold. It's colder than a polar bear's
Stay
mouth out
safe.
there.
man.
I ain't going out there. It's too cold out there. Hey, Sky. Sky live.
No, I'm still here.
So, RJ.
Hey, man.
No, I'm right
If you
here.
gotta do any removals, it ain't gonna hurt him. It's cold out there. The body ain't gonna get messed up in there.
What's up, RJ?
Just sit him outside. Sit the body outside if you gotta do a removal. It ain't gonna mess him up.
No, what I did. Hold on. Let me show y'all. Hold on. Let me show you. Hold on 1 second. We got a lot. Hold on.
You got a lot. We ain't
I
got
got
a
the
lot.
remove
You got
van
a lot.
outside. I put a sheet over the windshield.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing a removal, Sky? I'll lose
My
them.
puppy. Ma'am.
Are you doing
We say-
removal?
Oh, never mind. She back.
What you say, Miss Eats?
Are you doing removals today?
Yes. No, I'm at the house. I keep the van in here at the house. Yes, ma'am. I'm on call all this week.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's
So
whatever.
I put a sheet over the windshield, and for it won't take long to get the ice off.
That's smart.
So, yes, ma'am. But we got a lot.
We're getting it now. Unfortunately, it's not snow. It's just sheets of ice here.
Ours is mixed with snow and sleet.
Ugh. Well, y'all
bit
stay
chilly
warm.
weather.
Be careful.
Y'all
I'm
too.
gonna leave now.
y'all
So
later.
let me know if y'all need anything.
Okay. Y'all take care.
Bye, y'all.
All right.